Good morning. I'm Casey Nelson, the incoming chair of ELITExas. Thank you for joining us early this morning to kick off the first ever virtual InsureCon. I'm excited to have brand strategist and author Steve McKee with us for a special presentation before he gives his keynote, Growth in a Time of Disruption, at 10 a.m. There is still time to register to attend that session if you haven't already. Just go to iiat.org/InsureCon and click on the registration link for the session. I encourage all of you to attend. Before we begin, I want to thank the ELITExas sponsors for making this all possible. Thank you very much to Allied Trust, Assurant, ePay Policy, Insurers Indemnity, Service Lloyds, State Auto, Texas Mutual, TexCap Insurance, Union Standard, and Quest Pro. Also, a special thanks to everybody who joined the ELITExas Feeding Texas Challenge with your help, and with a $17,000 $640 match from IIAT, we were able to raise $35,280 to feed Texans in need. The total combined donation will provide almost 140,000 meals to Texans who need food. Thank you for all of you. Thank you to all of you who participated in this fundraiser. It is not too late to help. Donations can still be made until June 18th. Please look for the donation link on the iiat.org homepage. On that note, I hope you'll join me and other members who contributed to the Feeding Texas at the ELITExas Community Service Project celebration on Thursday, June 18th at 2:30 p.m. You should have received a link to join the celebration after you donated. If you didn't get that link, please contact Jill Douglas. I look forward to celebrating with all of you. We are happy to have Steve McKee join us again this morning. When we last heard from Steve at Joe Vincent in January, he introduced us to the concept of the disruption cycle. At that time, we never could have imagined the level of disruption that is currently taking place. Steve is the co-founder of McKee Walwork Company, a nationally recognized marketing advisory firm that specializes in generating new momentum for stalled, stuck, and stale organizations. He is the author of When Growth Stalls, How It Happens, Why You're Stuck, and What to Do About It, and also Power Branding, Leveraging the Success of the World's Best Brands, which the New York Times called the definitive book on modern branding that should be mandatory reading in every business school in America. He also writes a monthly column for Smart Brief on leadership and is the co-founder of Passare, a tech spinoff of MWC, which is redefining an entire industry. Please join me in welcoming Steve McKee.
Good morning. I was having trouble with my mute there for a moment. Really appreciate everybody being here and giving me some time this morning. This has been a fascinating study, and as Casey said, we are in the midst of something called disruption, are we not? We've all been dealing with that for some period of time, and it's a fascinating proposition that we're all trying to deal with. So what I wanted to do this morning, before we get into the main session, where we're going to show some really fascinating results across the IIAT membership, is do a sneak peek for the elite. And so I'll just tell you right now that probably 10 or 15% of what you're going to see right now will overlap with what you'll see then, but do plan to attend both sessions because there's a lot of different content and I think you're going to find it fascinating, hopefully. So I want to begin with a quote from the former CEO of 3M, which I just find fascinating, and I mentioned this at the Joe Vincent seminar, this whole concept that the core of every business is dying. And it's like, can you really say that? You know, that's kind of a depressing thought. But for those of you who are at Joe Vincent, if you remember, I asked you to name, a 200-year-old company or a 300-year-old company. It's very difficult to do because things change. And sometimes businesses, are born and grow and shrink and die in a matter of a few decades. Sometimes it is a few centuries. But our task as business leaders is to keep our businesses alive. It's kind of like tending a garden. if you will. It doesn't grow without us. So in that context, this is something that we believe at McKee Wallwork and Company that has really come to define how we do what we do. And this is this quote from Richard Rumelt, who's a professor at UCLA, where he says, the most important element of strategy is to figure out what's going on out there first. Because if you start to make your plans based on bad information, you're going to have a problem. And, I'm just thinking of the coronavirus shutdowns all over the country where different governors, have made different decisions based on different inputs. And we still don't know, who's right and who's wrong. But it's caused a fair amount of chaos because there has not been at least nationally, there's not been a coherent viewpoint about the virus at work, if you want to put it that way, right? Some people, whether it's communicability or its deadliness or those sorts of things. And as a result, we've got a lot of cacophony sort of in our economic situation. That's just kind of a very real recent example at a macro level. At a micro level, it does apply to our businesses that if you are misunderstanding what's happening in your world, you're very likely to make wrong decisions. And the flip side of that, of course, is if you have insight into it that your competitors don't have, you can really be ahead of the game. And so with that as an inspiration, we embarked on the disruption cycle research beginning a couple of years ago. Many of you took this study, and those of you who took it should have received your report yesterday. If you didn't, circle back with Matt or me, and we'll make sure that happens. I'd like to explain to you how to read it, but I also want to give you an overview of what we're looking at here. But the disruption cycle it's building upon the 15 years of research that McKee Wallwork has done into growth and the hindrances thereof. And we found it to be extremely helpful as we help our clients diagnose their situation. So, the business cycle isn't new. We didn't invent it. You have the adoption curve here that everybody's familiar with, from innovators to laggards. And the cycle really tracks with that. When you're in the innovation and early adoption phase, your companies are typically in acceleration mode. The early majority begins to adopt it. That's the maturation mode. Saturation comes, late majority, and then laggards. And one way to look at this chart is that below the line there, it's describing the customer base, innovators, early adopters, early majority. And above the line, it's really just sort of presenting the company or the industry as it relates to the customer base. And so that's how we look at the cycle. Again, we didn't invent it, but we did pioneer this way to understand it. So just to familiarize you all with it, if you were to look at the restaurant industry, the fast food industry, generally speaking, is pretty commoditized. You can get a lot of food for under $1, which is kind of scary because I'm not sure it's food, but very price competitive. There's one on every corner. They compete based on seconds at the drive-through. It's just a really difficult business to manage. In saturation mode, you have coffee shops, which might be changing as half of them are going out of business now because you can't go to them. But this is where, there's not hard to find a coffee shop and getting increasingly hard to differentiate a coffee shop. Maturation mode, you might want to think of, the Chipotles of the world or the Mod Pizzas or these sort of fast casual places where you get in line and you make your Mexican food or your Asian food or your pizza. They're growing pretty quickly. They still have a ways to go, but it's sort of the hot new thing. And then, in acceleration mode, I put street tacos. It's kind of hard to see because we're looking for trends that are evolving, but it seems like everywhere I travel, this is the thing. Or, at restaurants, it's kind of the hot thing to put on the menu. So just as an example of how in every industry with which we're familiar, there is a cycle and companies go through it. And, perhaps most notable example is Apple Computer, which started in a garage, accelerated rapidly, began to mature rapidly, and then found its first point of saturation in the mid to late 1980s when pretty much everybody had a computer on their desktop. I don't want to overstate that, but the market did get saturated, and Apple ran into its first period of rough waters. The founding CEO was fired, which is not a small thing. It's kind of a big deal. And that's what happens when companies are in this mode. And Apple almost went out of business, but famously they bought Steve Jobs' company, hired him back. He reinvented with the new, the iMac and the iPhone and the iPod, and the company began a whole new cycle. till it got to the point where everybody had a smartphone. This is the tech industry. This is why I'm so glad I'm not in the tech industry. Everybody had a smartphone. Then the great pioneer, died, and then Apple started oddly being accused of things that Microsoft is accused of, like being a bad actor and a bad apple. And then famously, again, Apple has recently reconfigured itself as a services company to enter the third phase of the cycle. And early returns are suggesting that's a good decision. Point here is 45-year-old company embarking on its third trip through the cycle. That's brutal. It's really brutal. But what it does do is condition you. I mean, if you're in the tech industry, there's no mistaking this, right? It conditions you to be on the lookout for whether you describe it in disruption cycle terms for continuous innovation. Whereas in other industries, it's easier to fall asleep and not recognize that the pace of change is picking up. It really doesn't matter the industry. What automation and the internet and our global culture connected economy has done is it's picked up the pace of acceleration, and I don't think that's going to turn around. Even something like the shutdown that we're experiencing and the fallout that's going to come from it, that actually might speed up the cycle, not slow it down, as companies are forced to innovate just to figure out how to stay in business. So in 2018, and it feels like a century ago, it was only 2 years ago, we commissioned our first study, and it was economy-wide. And this is what the economy looked like. You had about 70% of companies on the left side of the cycle. It was a healthy and growing economy. We were in the midst of the longest expansion, I think, in history. And about 30% of the economy was, saturation, commoditization mode. It's kind of a natural thing. You got growth on the one side, and then death on the other, and then rebirth. You had 1% in disruption. And then we didn't have anything to compare it to because this was our benchmark, but it felt kind of right in terms of the overall economy. Then a year later, we went into the real estate industry and we did a project like this with them. And as you might be able to infer, for those of you who know anything about residential real estate, kind of an aging industry, kind of a tired business model. Some companies are innovating, but you have, more than half of all companies on the right side of the cycle there, which is just suggesting that some more innovation might be necessary. There are some key disruptors to the real estate industry that are coming in from the outside, whether it's Zillow or Trulia or Purple Bricks or those kind of companies, and they're really stirring the pot. What they've done is they've awakened, some sleeping giants, more traditional players in the industry, which have been innovating, accelerating, and maturating. This is kind of how the thing happens. We did it in the funeral industry also last year, and as you might imagine, even worse, they're in even worse shape. And this is reflective of the fact that this industry has been in the midst of a 100-year cycle. So you've had 2 generations or maybe 3 who think the way it's always been done is the way it always will be done. And that's what happens when the cycle turns slowly, is it lulls you to sleep. So you got 65% of the market kind of saying, wait a minute, what's happening? We're going out of business. And that's a real problem for obvious reasons. So these are the numbers for the IIAT agency members. And we're going to go into them a little more in depth in the next session, but you might find it interesting. It's like, okay, what does this mean? It's half and half. Not as bad as the funeral industry, certainly, or the real estate industry, but it's kind of an interesting spread of companies through the cycle. I wonder what elite members look like. Elite members look more elite. And let me just click through to compare the two here. Whoops, I just did something bad. There we go. In black, you see the elite member breakdown, and in red, you see the overall agency member breakdown. I don't know if you're surprised. I'm not. I suppose I might be surprised at the significance of the difference, because you've got, much more. You're at 80% on the left side among the elites, and only 50% for the members, and the inverse on the other side. So congratulations. I mean, there is clearly there's a differentiation here between, the elite are the elite for a reason. So I want to go through a handful of the results. First explain to you how to read your own results, but then go through a handful of them that I found interesting, where we saw the bigger differences between elite and the rest of the membership. A couple of head scratchers I want to go through with you that are not really explicable. I want to challenge you with that. And then we should be able to bring this thing in for a landing. So those of you who got your report, this is the first page, and this is how you read this particular survey. So if more than one person, well, in this case, I'm sorry, I'm getting the two confused. Your answers are presented on the left there, and so they're a single color. Red is bad, green is good, yellow is in the middle. Then all ELITExas answers are the middle chart, and then all answers for IIAT are on the right, if that makes sense. Now, the one thing that could be confusing, but that we have found to be most helpful, is the scale of color actually changes whether the question is a negative or a positive. So for instance, in the we tend to overthink things, strongly agreeing with that is a negative, and so it's red. Whereas we operate like a well-oiled machine, strongly agree is a positive, and so it's a green. And the reason that I need to explain this to you, we think it makes better sense, is that you can, by flipping through your book, almost like a comic book, just look for red or green. Because if it's red, that's not good, and if it's green, it's good. And then you can dive into the answers. So instead of spending all your time trying to compare the numbers in the pie chart to the scale at the bottom, which is what we normally do when we read these things, and it gets kind of tiring, let color be your guide. If it's all green, it's all good. If it's all red, it's all bad. If it's yellow, it's somewhere in the middle. Hopefully that makes sense to you. We found that that is sort of the best way to handle this. So a number of results that we found were interesting was this question of the marketplace has changed and we don't know our place in it. So a strong agreement is a negative thing. And pretty impressive that among the elite members, you got 71% there that disagree with that statement, and 29% are somewhat neutral on it. Whereas with the membership at large, almost a quarter of the membership would agree in the affirmative with this question. And that's, again, partly reflective of the overall differences. Probably won't be a lot that surprises you in here. Our company's embarking on uncharted territory. Red is bad. Let me rephrase that to red is certainly challenging. That's why it's red. Because if you're embarking on uncharted territory, it's like, we don't know where we're going or what we're doing. And here too, a fair amount of you are, you agreed with that statement, some are neutral. And I think that's a fair reflection of the fact that, of reality, that, the world in which we're living is somewhat uncharted. But all members, the membership at large is challenged a little bit more with this question. We're achieving our marketing objectives. Look at that. 57% say yes, compared to only 41% of the membership at large. What's cause and what's effect? Are you elite because you're achieving your marketing objectives? Are you achieving your marketing objectives because you're elite? Doesn't matter. I mean, for this purpose, it doesn't matter. There's a correlation there, and that makes sense. Similarly, we're achieving our goals with increasing efficiency. This is something that really shows, is a reflection of a maturation of a company, that you should be achieving increasing efficiency, because it's not just about spending money, to achieve top line, that you want to become increasingly better run as an organization. So you're achieving your goals with increasing efficiency, and you can see, not bad performance on the right, but ELITExas members are certainly outperforming. We're funding our marketing plan sufficiently. I was encouraged and heartened to see this, because this is, a lot of companies don't. Well, a fair amount of you all don't. Almost a quarter say you don't, and a little more than a quarter are a little ambivalent about that. So I would encourage you to fund it sufficiently, because this is like real evidence of, again, we don't necessarily know cause and effect here, the difference between elite and members, but correlation is pretty strong. That the more effectively you're funding it, the more efficient you're being and execute it, the more likely you are to be able to achieve your marketing objectives, especially during times of recession, which is something we're going to talk a little bit more about in 2 weeks when we have our breakout sessions. We are trying to be all things to all people. Not so much. You still struggle with that a little bit. I think we all do. Again, this was fielded pre-corona. So depending upon what your reaction has been to the shutdown, you might not perform as well on this question, because when we're scrambling for business, sometimes you you start to compromise and expand your service, expand your outreach a little bit. Sometimes you tend to focus more. But here again, elite members tend to be more focused than members at large. So in some respects, if I was talking to all membership, looking at the elite results is kind of a roadmap to how to improve, and that's telling, and that might be something you all want to look at. Our competitive differentiation is growing. I think you can see as I'm going through this how all these things kind of stack on one another and they begin to add up. Your differentiation is growing better than the membership at large. It's partly a function of knowing who your customers are, and partly a function of your spending, and partly a function of being more efficient. All this stuff works together. And our growth is outpacing our ability to maintain quality, reflective of a well-run organization. Still a challenge. 35%, a full third of you would agree with this statement, but not nearly as big of a number as the membership at large. Your mind is probably spinning a little bit as I'm going through this, because you want to think about and process like not only each of these statements, but how they all relate to one another. And I would say that's exactly the point. So I'm teasing you a little bit here with this presentation today, and I really encourage you to spend some time with your reports. And at the end of the next presentation this morning, I have a very simple way of encouraging you to do that. So we'll show you how to do that. Okay, well, here's something that's true industry-wide. We're constantly battling price pressure. This we see in spades throughout this whole survey. You all seem to have a little bit better command on it than the membership at large, but whereas some of the previous questions were really reflective of how you manage your company, this one is sort of reflective of just the marketplace, and there's, it is what it is. So I wasn't surprised to see this. This may be one of the most significant signals to the industry that you want to be dealing with. I know you're not surprised by it. Obviously, you reported it, but we'll be talking a lot about this as time goes on. Employees are in sync with leadership here. Good to see this. It's a pretty good report, and internal dynamics, I have to say, for the membership at large were pretty good, especially relative to other industries, which I think is a terrific sign. Even better for the elites, though, that you seem to have people in sync there. If you don't, that's something you want to look at. And again, we'll talk more about that as we go, but this is more about the corporate culture piece of what you're dealing with, as is ready, fire, aim. All companies struggle with this to some extent. ELITExas members a little less so than the membership at large. We are outgrowing our internal systems. Again, a function of how you're managing the organization and how well you're adapting to growth or the challenges of the marketplace. So little bit of an issue here with you all, and it may be because of your growth, maybe because of your outperformance, that you're having to deal with this in a more relevant way than the membership at large. That's something for you to think about. That's just conjecture on my part. We're more opportunistic than strategic. Generally speaking, companies that are more opportunistic than strategic struggle more. There is a difference between strategic opportunism and opportunism, but generally speaking, that's true. And so you all perform better on this score than the membership at large, which would suggest that you are more strategic in nature. Again, probably a reflection of the elite membership. Same with speed is more important than quality right now. Companies kind of get into this mode when they're struggling, and so you don't want to be in that mode. You want to keep quality first, even though speed is important, and you all score very well on this one. I'd rather spend money improving the product than improving the brand. Good for you. 71% disagree with that statement. 21% are ambivalent about it. You got to be focused on the brand. And when I show you where you fall in the cycle and the implications thereof, can't underscore this enough. There's a time to sow and there's a time to reap. And if you're doing well, it's a time to sow, and you sow in your brand reputation, and you sow your equity, because when times get tough, that's when you have to reap it. Just like a politician, they build their political equity and then they got to spend it at some point. And we all have to spend it at some point, so you want to build it while you can build it. And then we've recently gone through leadership succession, or soon go through it. Now, this is indicated as a negative. It's kind of hard because you have to give a color to it. The reason that it's indicated as a negative is not because it's a bad thing. It's because it's typically a stressor for companies. It's a challenging thing for companies. So you all are more likely to have gone through it or going to be going through it. And I think that's a function of just kind of how the group is constructed, partly, if I'm not mistaken. But I say this, like I said, it's not a bad thing that you're going through succession, but it does raise issues, and it often derails companies, or at least gets them a little bit dizzy and off their focus. And that is an area of expertise that we consult on at McKee Walworth & Company. Not only do we consult on it, we've been going through it, so we've got a very personal view on it. There's right ways and there's wrong ways, and there are several things that can trip you up. And I don't want to get into the details of that on this presentation, but let me just simply say there are lots of lawyers and accountants you can talk to about getting the lawyering and the accounting right, and consultants, who can tell you the formulas for valuation and stuff like that. The biggest issue that companies have with succession, and the reason why most succession efforts fail, is the internal dynamics that are caused by, and often not even realized by, the psychology that the incoming and the outgoing are both dealing with. And it's a fascinating thing to look at, to study. And if you want to talk offline about that, I'd be happy to chat with you offline. Let me just say, if you're having issues with your succession plan, don't be surprised and don't despair, because they can be identified and they can be addressed. I'm more bullish on my future than I was a year ago. Y'all are more optimistic. I don't know if it's true. Again, cause and effect. Are you more successful because you're more optimistic, or are you more optimistic because you're more successful? I don't care. It's a good thing. So it's good to see that you're more bullish on your future. Do want to be careful. Again, this was pre-COVID, so I don't know if your opinion has changed. Nobody knows what's going to happen over the next 6 months, but this is reflective of your headiness as you run your companies. So those are just a handful. There's 51, I think, pie chart questions, and that was probably 15 of them that we saw the most differences on. Here we get to, we asked everybody what one word sums up your biggest business challenge. This is just your basic word cloud. And not really surprisingly, time and those sort of things rise to the top. But I would also point out, if you look at the ELITExas word cloud, there are fewer words there. If you go to talent, personnel, employee, recruiting, maybe even professionalism, maybe experience, if you put those all in a bucket, that's going to be the biggest word, right? That's going to be the biggest concept. So time is a big deal, but also staffing in a big way. You see over on the right a lot of the same words, but price is up there, efficiency, rate. So a little bit more reflective of how they're dealing with the pressure on pricing and margins, but a lot of issues with time and staffing. And that's really interesting. And we see in the overall results, what we saw was there are staffing issues at both ends. If you're succeeding and growing, you have staffing issues. And if you're struggling, you have staffing issues. And they, for different reasons, but they both rear their ugly head. And that's partly reflective of the economy in which we live. It's partly reflective of the industry in which you operate, I'm certain. And there are different strategies for dealing with it in different ways. What do you fear most about the future of your company? Look at those cocky people on the right. Nothing. The reason that that's so big is because it was a lot bigger universe, obviously, of people, a few hundred. And so if a handful of them, I don't know what the number is, said nothing, boldly said nothing, that's going to show up big. But, growth on that side, change among ELITExas members, keeping up, technology, squeeze, that's an interesting word, margins, profit, kind of dealing with that whole thing. It's kind of what you see here is an intuitive understanding of the cycle, that the things you're looking at in the future are the things that you're going to be increasingly struggling with as you go around the cycle. And that's margins being squeezed and keeping up and adopting new technology and generating organic growth and all those things that companies deal with. So it's kind of interesting. You can spend some time with this. A word cloud is only a word cloud. It's only a snapshot, but it's kind of interesting to see what everybody says in that regard. Now, I want to get into the internal dynamics of the study because this is important stuff. And again, those of you who were at Joe Vincent will recognize this. Those who weren't won't, but it's very simple to explain. Our original research, which resulted in When Growth Stalls and Brand versus Wild, are two sort of seminal books, looked at the internal dynamics that cause companies to struggle. And what we identified was 4 destructive dynamics that tend to trip up companies and or keep them tripped up, and you see them there. A lack of consensus or alignment among the management team. It's issue number 1. It's the most insidious because it's often unrecognized. It's the most common. And it's not always active aggression. It's usually passive aggression, which is why it's a problem. A loss of focus in the marketplace is number 2, is sort of drifting, not being sure who you are. And that can manifest itself in a lot of ways. It can manifest itself in your brand positioning, but also in your pricing courage, your willingness to hold the line, for example. This is who we are and this is who we aren't. Or in your breadth of product offerings, this is what we do and this is what we don't. So loss of focus can manifest itself in a number of ways. Loss of nerve, it's a real issue right now. When something happens, like a giant virus, or even in the last 2 weeks, the social unrest in our country, it's easy to lose your head. It's easy to cut your spending on marketing and on staffing and on training and on R&D. Sometimes you have to do that because you're trying to manage a decline in revenue. But it's something you really want to be careful of because you want to do that wisely but courageously and not lose your head. And you can't, as we're fond of saying, you can cut your way to survival but not to success. Loss of nerve isn't just how you manage your money, your expenses. It also has to do with when you're willing to take a step forward, when you think it's time to move again, how aggressively you message. That's a matter of loss of nerve. How willing you are to be bold in the marketplace. Those are all manifestations of nerve. And then inconsistency is the 4th one. When companies are faced with a significant event, it's easy to sort of, bolt about looking for a silver bullet solution. And that's where the opportunism versus strategy comes in. The flip side of that is where long-term growth is, and that is when you're aligned as a management team. Ideally, you want to be aligned all the way up and down the organization, from top to bottom. But at a minimum, around your conference table, you need to have alignment. That doesn't mean you always agree on everything. It means you always agree to align around decisions that are made. So you have your fights and you have your disagreements. That's a healthy culture. But when you disagree, you commit to it. Focus in the marketplace. This is who we are. This is who we're not. This is what we do. This is what we don't. Go to market with conviction. That is confidence. So you're willing to invest in your brand development. You're willing to invest in training and staffing, and you're willing to break the mold. You're not following your competitors. And then doing that consistently over time. What's crazy is it's difficult to remain in the green. It's a constant challenge. It's easy to fall back into the red. And sometimes you get thrown into the red by external events and you have to claw your way out. So as a management team at my company, we are always asking the 4 questions. I say always. Certainly during a crisis like we're facing, we do it regularly, like every week. How are we doing? Are we in agreement? Is anybody, checking out? Anybody losing their way? Anybody doubting? We have to make some significant decisions right now about what we're going to do, how we're going to handle this, and what we're not going to do. That affects focus. Let's manage our budget, but let's not be stupid, and let's not, be inconsistent. So if you're having that healthy conversation, typically you can navigate it well, unless there's a bad apple on your team, in which case it needs to be ejected. If you're not, you're not. So these are really important considerations. And ever since we did that original research, we have been studying this. So there's 20 particular questions that drive the calculation of this thermometer here that you see. This is a screenshot from our website that you answer 20 questions and it will give you a calculation of how you're doing, sort of a thermometer just to kind of take your temperature on the 4 issues. Well, those 20 questions are embedded in the disruption cycle survey. And as you look at the 4 stages of the cycle at the top there, you see the 4 typical profiles. Now, this is in general of companies that when they're in acceleration and maturation mode, all systems are green, they're doing pretty good. They are not perfect, because they never are, but you know, it's good times. You're making money, you're making your bonus, you're growing, you're feeling successful. And so generally speaking, the culture is good. When companies get to saturation mode is typically when you start to see the middling kind of results there. And it's kind of interesting that the first thing to tip is usually the lack of consensus, because as soon as you start to not be able to print money, as soon as you realize that maybe you're not as brilliant as you thought you were, you start to question yourself, and you might start to question the people across the table from you. And if left unaddressed, you get into full commoditization mode. It's Lord of the Flies, you know, inside of companies. It just gets bad. And we've lived this. I mean, for those of you who don't know our biography, Chapter 101, Grow Stalls, tells the story. We actually lived this. And then we did the research and documented it. And we said, oh my gosh, we were the first test case. The research that we did perfectly explained the Lord of the Flies journey we had. And that's when the lights went on for us. We said, this is too good not to share. So this is the pattern that companies go through. And then also, in general, if you talk about the one word that they struggle with and the fear most, those kind of questions, in the left side of the cycle, companies tend to be very focused on the marketplace. And so the things they talk about are things like, you know, competition and innovation and training and regulations and those sorts of things. On the right side, companies really start to navel gaze. And so, of course, pricing comes up and they start saying, well, our problem is leadership. Our problem is miscommunication. Our problem is nepotism in closely held businesses. It can be. And so the overarching lesson from this is, if you're on the right side of the wheel, you really need to turn your focus from yourself back to the marketplace. And there's a whole lot more to that. But generally speaking, that's how this model works. And if you look at the 4-factor analysis from this study for the ELITExas members versus all members, as I said, pretty good score for all members. It's not something to gloat on, because the green is not real green. It's not that far out. And not surprisingly, ELITExas performs better than the membership at large. So if I was your physician, you know, if I pointed that thermometer at your head and this is what your temperature came up, I'd be like, okay, you're healthy. You know, you can come in. But I would also say the pressure, the trend is always to push you towards the red. So you want to be careful. And I think the fact that ELITExas members outperform all members, given all the things we just looked at, is telling that you're outperforming all members on internal dynamics. That's correlating with your outperformance in the marketplace. Which is cause and which is effect, we don't know. But they go together. So I wouldn't be cocky or gloat about this, but you're healthy, which I'm pleased to say. Okay, I want to go through a handful of head scratchers. I look at these and I'm like, okay, I would think that there would be a difference here between ELITExas and regular members. And this might be something for you to take home and discuss. You might have the answer, or you might want to discuss it as a team. But here's a question. It's easy for prospects to tell us apart from other companies like us. This doesn't square with what I would have expected. And I don't pretend to know why. Maybe it's a flaw in the study. It is an anomaly, though. And so this really isn't a discussion format. If we have time, we have 20 minutes left. We have time, we could come back to this, or you could just be thinking about it yourself. But it's something that kind of caused me to scratch my head. As was this, the loyalty of our customers continue to grow. Now, the overall results here are almost identical if you look at all the green and the rest of it. But that's what surprised me a little bit. I think I might have expected the loyalty of your customers to grow more than the membership at large. Maybe not, because maybe that's driven or affected more by marketplace dynamics than by how well you serve them. And there's just not a whole lot you can do about it. Perhaps that's the answer, but I don't know. We need a new business model. Here too, this is something we're going to discuss with the group at large. 30%, 35% are convinced that they do. A quarter isn't sure. And those are both pretty big numbers. But your numbers look, pretty close. If you just look at the greens and the reds and the yellows, it's pretty close. Maybe it's the same as the last question as I'm talking myself through this, that's a function of the marketplace, that you all are outperforming all members, but that's because of the way that you're managing the company. Nevertheless, everybody in the industry is faced with the same headwinds and market dynamics, and so you're all recognizing you need a new model. Perhaps that's what answers that question. Okay, so those are just a few of the head scratchers. Really the only anomalies that I saw. You can go through it yourself and you can look, and I would encourage you to compare your answers to the membership at large. And generally speaking, what I would try to do is on each page for each question, ask why is it this way? Why do the results look like this? And when you answer that question for yourself, you just learn something. Either you just confirm something, it's like, okay, that's what I thought, or you have to figure it out and you just learn something. Now, I mentioned that the wheel continues to turn ever more quickly. And this is where agency members showed up on the disruption cycle phasing. This is where the elites showed up. Now, this is an average, okay? I showed you at the beginning how there's a distribution of companies around the wheel. If you average all of the results, this is where you land. And I think this is kind of fascinating. The agency members are right there, about to tip into saturation as an average. That's something we want to look at. You all are behind them, not behind them in a bad way. One of the things about disruption cycle management is you're not entirely a victim. You're not like on a Ferris wheel that's going to keep turning no matter what you do. It is going to keep turning, but there are strategies and tactics companies can take to slow the spin within the larger spin, or to manage the company differently. So you can stay in maturation mode. You can fight off saturation mode with the proper strategies and tactics. And that's probably somewhat reflective of what's going on here. Again, this is an average of all membership, so we're not looking at like a real company here, but I think it sort of reflects the way that you manage your organizations. So with that in mind, generally speaking, if you look at the overarching results, these are the characteristics that tend to define companies in maturation. Expanding, willing to take risks, challenge with growth, we see some of that. The uncharted territory, we're outgrowing our internal systems. Customers understand the value, they know what we stand for, our differentiation is growing. This is a lot of the things we saw in your responses. We're achieving our marketing objectives. As you tip into saturation, which is where everybody's going, at one speed or another, growth is slowing. People start to report that they have this sense of loss, maybe overthinking things. Speed issue becomes important. Rather spend money improving the product than improving the brand. We're more opportunistic than strategic. So this is what awaits you left untreated. Not to mention the destructive internal dynamics. And so I just wanted to go over a handful of general truths. We'll talk a lot more about this in the webinars that are coming up in a couple of weeks. But since you all are, as an average, sort of squarely scoring in this phase, this is my general advice to you. One is don't try to do it all at once. You have to pace yourself. Typically when you're growing, there's so much to be done. There's internal systems to be managed. There's external growth opportunities to be managed. There's staffing and training and hiring. You want to be careful because you can burn out in this phase. Number two, make hay when the sun shines. This is when you're making money. So make your money. We should be making money all the way around the cycle, right? But this is when your margins are going to be the healthiest. This is when you have the most pricing power in the marketplace, or volume power. I can put it that way as well, because you can add volume even with an existing margin. Make that hay while the sun shines. Invest that hay in systems and processes. This gets to being able to become more efficient because you're going to need it as the market continues to mature. So you want to invest in software and systems and processes and even internal cultural things and employee relations things. Often companies tend to lose their culture at this point because they're going from sort of the scrappy one for all and all for one mode to the corporate bureaucracy mode. And you want to be careful about that. build that brand equity while you can afford to. This is the time to invest in making people know you, helping people to know you, and helping them to like you and respect you. It's brand equity. That can be, advertising writ large in television and magazines and on the internet. It can be client relations sort of things, customer relations things, whatever it is that builds those bonds of affection and trust to you is what you want to be investing in. Share the rewards with your team. As the rewards are coming in, share them, whether it's profit sharing or bonuses or salaries or golf trips or however you do it. Share the rewards with your team, because there's going to come a time when you need them to be loyal. You always do, but there's going to come a time where their loyalty is going to matter even more to you. And so you take care of them now, they'll take care of you then. Watch for a loss of focus. This is it's easy in the maturation phase to get cocky, to start thinking that you're able to do more than you're able to do, or that you're better than you are. And this is where some companies drift. The example I always like to tell is of Under Armour. When it was doing real well, Under Armour got cocky and expanded into Kohl's, which was a loss of focus. They went into a store where kids' moms shop, not the kids themselves. And they just kind of lost their way, and they're still struggling as a result of it. And then typically in maturation mode is when companies begin thinking, or should begin thinking, about succession. Very often we see them wait until commoditization mode, especially in a closely held business where the cycle of the company is tracking with the cycle of the ownership's career. So if you're in a 40-year cycle and you have a 40-year career, just as you're wanting to get out, the company is kind of getting tired. That's one of the problems. So you want to begin thinking about succession early, and get people involved early, because ideally succession is a decade-long event. It's not 2 years, it's a decade. Of course, that's a generalism. There's a lot of exceptions to that, but you want to begin thinking about it before you're ready to retire. Okay, so George, the core of every business is dying. That's what we began with. He went on to say every business has a dying core, naturally, because that's the old heart of the business. The way you're going to be able to grow the business is by making sure of two things: that you have the balance right between how you manage the decline or stability of the core. That's what we've been talking about, how you manage in the cycle, and what you do in new areas. Both are important. You can't neglect either. If you think it's all about the core, you're slowly going to go out of business. If you think it's all about the new, you're going to neglect your core business and your cash cow. It's really a matter of striking a balance between the two. So, as I'm fond of saying, we all know about this concept of creative destruction, that the economy is going to move forward whether we like it or not, that it's good for consumers. It's good for us as consumers, because outdated and old is replaced with new and responsive. But it can be not so good for purveyors and providers. 15%, in a normal year, 15% of all jobs are destroyed. 17% of jobs are created, and you get a net growth of 2 in the GDP. That's basically how the math works. That's good for everyone except the 15%. So you want to not be in the 15% of those jobs that are destroyed, recognizing that this is a truism. Our job as leaders is to foster creative disruption. That is, be the disruptor, not the disruptee or the disrupted. We want to be the ones who are causing, the wheel to turn, not victims of the wheels turning. So you can either be a victim of creative destruction, leading to it, or an agent of change that really leads to creation and helps the wheel spin forward, and not only propels the economy, but propels your company forward. So that's the sneak peek for the elite. As I mentioned, in the next session, we're going to look at a lot of different information that I think you're going to find fascinating. We're going to look at all the results by phase, and based on what phase you're in, I think you're going to find that interesting. But I suppose now what we can do, if we have 10 minutes, and I'll defer to our IIAT folks, if we want to open up the mics or open up the chat function, ask questions, happy to do whatever works.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can either raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can type your question in the chat feature. I don't see anything coming in at the moment.
Stunned silence.
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
Steve, this is Casey. Matt, I went ahead and unmuted myself. Steve, in your presentation, you had a section there where I can't remember how you said it, but you said that some of the results were not confusing, but just didn't necessarily make sense. I was wondering, the very first set of data that you showed, I can't remember again what exactly it was. I should have taken a note, but if you could go back to it, I don't know if you can, and just if you could let us know, like, what are some possible causes where I think the ELITExas survey responses indicated that we were, I think we were less, or we thought that we needed to respond to our clients. I can't remember. I'm sorry, I'm babbling like a fool, but I do think that there was some really interesting things that you brought up that I wonder if it could be discussed a little bit more.
Sure, I can, if this works, I can jump out of I can go to slide sorter if this works for you all, and if you can still see it. We can go up to the head scratchers, that's what I called them here. And let me just make this bigger and we can kind of look at them together, we're all friends. These were the head scratchers, and what they meant, so the pie charts that I presented up above were like, okay, that makes sense. These are elite, I get it. These are the ones that didn't make so much sense. I'm just trying to get them big enough here. So for those of you who can see, it's easy for prospects to tell us, let me do one more. Where are we? Here we are. Easy for prospects to tell us apart from other companies like us.
Yes.
That was the biggest head scratcher because you underperformed. The other two, I think we talked about in terms of customer loyalty and needing a new business model, that may be a function of the marketplace, and it's just a reflection of reality. So is this what you were referring to?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. So that first one, that it's easy for prospects to tell us apart from other companies. So I wonder, I mean, if the elite group or we are more critical of ourselves or of our business models. I mean, I feel like in our agency that we do a phenomenal job at a lot of things, but I feel like if I was, you know, John Doe looking at my agency versus any other agency, I don't think from the outside that they would be able to tell us apart. Do you think that there's anything to that feeling or to that data, or something we should be doing as a result of that data?
It's a good question. I don't know. You know, to the question of are we harder on ourselves, because it's true, this is your opinion. Are we harder on ourselves? I would think not, only because on all the other questions, you know, it was consistent with what seemed to be reality. This was sort of an outlier and an anomaly. I just honestly don't know the answer here. I think it's worth, I don't think it's worth worrying about.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth thinking about, because it may just be that, you know, admittedly, it's a small sample size, okay? So we don't want to be, on the all members, it's a few hundred, so that's a good sample size. On the elite, it's a pretty small sample size, so you don't want to read too much into it. And so I wouldn't like worry about it, but it's worth pondering, and perhaps somebody could come up with a theory. And whatever the case, the goal is to make it easy for prospects to be able to tell you apart from other companies. I don't know if there's a different mix of business lines. I don't know.
Okay, cool.
Well, it looks like those are all the questions we had. Thanks for those questions, Casey.
Hey, absolutely. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and end this for us all. Thank you, Steve, so much. Thank you for your presentation to ELITExas, and thank you to the ELITExas sponsors for making this possible. Just a quick reminder that a recording of this session and all of today's virtual InsureCon sessions will be available at iiat.org on Monday. Oh, sorry, Matt, I was going too fast. I hope that you guys will all attend Steve's keynote, Growth in a Time of Disruption, at 10 a.m. Remember, there's still time to register for free. If you go to iiat.org/InsureCon and click on the registration button next to the session title on the schedule. Thanks again, everybody, for coming in. Thank you, Mr. McKee, and we will see you all very soon.